tomorrow's my birthday, but more importantly, it is Kazuha's long-awaited rerun, and there is no better way to spend said birthday than by making a complete updated 2.8 guide for the dude, and also C6ing him on Twitch when he comes out. So, hello Dragonfly Swarm! Kazuha is a 5-star Anemo support and sub-DPS unit that has garnered a very large reputation as one of the most powerful characters in Genshin Impact because of not only his very high sub-DPS damage potential, not just his one-of-a-kind team-wide elemental damage buffing potential, but also because of his ability to fit comfortably into almost any team in Genshin Impact. But do not let that hype get to you just yet, because he is by far one of the most complex characters in the game due to the sheer amount of mechanical interactions his kit has with the rest of Genshin's gameplay environment. So, as much as he is an invaluable asset to any team performing elemental damage, he is equally useless as a support if played incorrectly. So today, I'm gonna go over a full guide on Kazuha in 2.8, discussing the important details of his kit, his best gear, and what stats to focus on depending on your playstyle, how best to team comp with him, and of course, the things you need to know in order to make him one of the strongest supports in your character arsenal. So, with as little bias as possible, let's begin the greatest character in the game to ever exist guide with his kit. Kazuha's attack talent is generally not used given that he's most commonly played as a buffer support and off-field DPS. However, it is important to note that if you want him to deal extra damage, the plunging attack modifiers on this talent do actually help to scale the plunge damage of his elemental skill. So, contrary to controversial Twitter guide belief, if you plan on leveling up his skill for damage, you might as well also level up his attack talent because it's a very noticeable damage increase. Beyond that though, it will never be optimal to use Kazuha's attacks outside of the skill plunge unless he's C6, so it's an ignorable talent overall. However, speaking of Kazuha's elemental skill, the ability itself seems relatively simple on paper because it just launches him into the air and then allows him to plunge down, pulling enemies towards him and dealing anemo damage, but it's actually extremely complex, so let's break it down in a simple way. The skill itself has a press version and a hold version. The press version generates 3 particles, pulling enemies and applying a low instance of anemo. The hold version generates 4 particles, pulls enemies more powerfully, and applies a heavy instance of anemo. Pressing the ability puts it on a 6-second cooldown, holding puts it on a 9-second cooldown. It's important to note that Kazuha's first ascension passive gives this skill the ability to infuse its plunge with hydro, pyro, cryo, or electro upon contact, causing the plunge to deal bonus damage based on the element he infused it with. This does mean that Kazuha can essentially set up 2 swirls in quick succession, once on cast and then again when he plunges, but the plunge won't always cause swirl, because it always accounts for the infused element's reactions before swirls. So if, for example, you plunge with hydro infusion on an enemy affected by electro, you won't trigger another swirl, you'll trigger electro charge. However, it also means that Kazuha's heavy anemo application when he performs the hold version of the skill allows him to very easily set up what's called a double swirl. Double swirling is a mechanic in which an anemo character simultaneously swirls 2 elements, causing 4-piece viridescent shred to trigger for both elements, but in Kazuha's case, it also allows him to grant his team-wide elemental damage bonus to both elements, which is a huge damage increase especially in freeze and taser teams as well as some vaporized teams where both the hydro characters and the other elemental carry are generally dealing somewhat equally substantial damage. Finally, with the skill, when it comes to team rotations, if you're wondering whether pressing or holding the skill is more optimal, press the skill if for whatever reason he'll be back on the field within the 6-second cooldown, otherwise just hold the skill. Most rotations last way longer than 9 seconds anyways, so you won't be doing any harm by holding the skill for its added benefits. Moving on though, Kazuha's elemental burst is yet another complex but very powerful ability in his arsenal. It's a 60 energy cost burst that causes him to perform a large AoE anemo damage slash, which then generates a huge field that will absorb whatever element it comes into contact with, dealing 5 ticks of simultaneous anemo damage and infused element damage over 8 seconds. There are a few important things to note about this ability in order to fully capitalize on Kazuha's kit, especially as a support. Firstly, the simultaneous anemo and infused element damage will not automatically trigger swirl every tick if no other elements are present on an enemy. They'll just apply the infused element to the enemy, but even then this isn't a big issue at all because the burst will pretty much always end up causing a swirl from the element it infused with, which does in fact allow Kazuha to reliably abuse his 4th ascension passive from off the field. And what is his 4th ascension passive? Well, it's basically the ability that makes him one of the strongest buffers in the game. It causes him to grant himself and his entire team an elemental damage bonus to whatever element he swirls anytime he swirls it, and the bonus is based on his elemental mastery. This passive makes full elemental mastery builds very worthwhile for Kazuha in teams that benefit from elemental damage, especially in teams like Freeze and Taser, both of which teams can reliably abuse double swirl, which does, as I said, grant his Ascension 4 elemental damage bonus for both elements. Back to Kazuha's burst, another important thing to keep in mind is that Kazuha, unlike I believe believe any other Anemo unit in the game has not one, but two abilities with 2U or heavy instance of Anemo, this one being on the initial slash of his burst. Yes, the first Anemo damage slash he performs does apply a heavy instance of Anemo just like the hold version of his skill, which allows him yet another way of easily performing a double swirl, making him the superior buffer for a wide number of teams. Finally, one last note regarding Kazuha's burst, it follows an elemental priority as to what element it will infuse with if, for example, it comes into contact with multiple elements at once. It's gonna prioritize infusing with Pyro first and foremost, then Hydro, then Electro, then Cryo. And this is very important to note for your rotation setup because infusing the wrong element essentially locks you out of Kazuha's buffing potential for an entire rotation. In Pyro DPS teams, this won't matter nearly as much because you'll pretty much always infuse Pyro first, but as a weird example, for teams with, say, an Electro DPS using Bennett as a support, you'll have to adjust your rotation so that you're very careful not to apply Pyro to enemies before Kazuha infuses his burst with Electro. As for talent priority, Kazuha is very interesting because as a support character, you could theoretically leave all of his talents at level 1 and it wouldn't have any hindrance to his top tier supporting capabilities because all of his support comes from his A4 passive and swirls. But most people like damage, so at the very least you can level up his burst first, then his skill, and then his attack talent last. And again, if you do plan on leveling his skill, you might as well invest at least a few levels into his attack simultaneously for the plunge modifier. Okay, Constellations. Kazuha was released as part of a weird new wave of characters that had kinda hit or miss constellations, so the good news is that even at C0, he's one of the best characters in the game. That's unchanged. But let's discuss these constellations anyways. C1 is pretty commonly misinterpreted as a great constellation, which it really isn't. There are quite a few situations in which using his double plunge will result in noticeably lower team damage for a support Kazuha, not just because he's unnecessarily prolonging his own field time, but also because he's cutting his team buff short for his carries. So unless you're commonly playing teams with mid to high downtime, you probably won't notice this constellation all that much at all. I will say though, in teams where double plunging isn't detrimental to the rotations, it does provide a hefty amount of energy for Kazuha, allowing him to focus less on energy recharge stats and even more on offensive stats. At C2 though, Kazuha solidifies his spot as the best Anemo support in the game, even outperforming Sucrose's supportive capabilities in teams that need elemental mastery for higher damage output. And I don't want to overly sugarcoat this constellation because there are rare scenarios where Sucrose can still compete with C2 Kazuha, but those are situational, few and far between scenarios. Since he himself also benefits from the 200 elemental mastery, it will allow him to grant an even higher elemental damage bonus to his team, as well as obviously even higher swirl damage, and his own teammates in reaction teams can enjoy a considerable bonus to their own reaction damage. Overall, amazing constellation to shoot for if you want to overkill your Kazuha's strength. C3 grants 3 skill levels, which is cool for extra skill damage, but that's all it does. C4 is the real energy management constellation, unlike C1, as this constellation actually does reliably ease Kazuha's energy requirements. The ability to grant himself bonus energy when he uses his skill is quite enjoyable, although the whole gliding passive thing is useless outside of the overworld, but it's still a good constellation if you want to focus less on ER percent and more on elemental mastery or other offensive stats. C5 grants 3 levels to his burst, which again is nothing more than increased damage, but it's nice if you want it. And finally, C6 is actually a really weird constellation for a Genshin character because it kind of completely changes the way you'll be able to play Kazuha. At C6, the Anemo infusion his abilities provide will allow him to run pretty reliably as a main DPS if you so choose, but it's also decent in theory for warranting more field time to a support Kazuha in teams such as Taser teams, where acting as an Anemo infused driver won't actually be that bad of a strategy. It also slightly shifts the way that you'll want to build him if you decide to run main DPS Kazuha, because he'll technically benefit more from offensive main stats rather than full elemental mastery, but overall it's just a really weird constellation that I doubt anyone will shoot for unless they're like me and unhealthily obsessed with Kazuha. But yeah, it's nice to keep in mind that Kazuha overall honestly doesn't need constellations to uphold his intimidating reputation, but if you want him to be at his absolute strongest, C2 is relatively not unrealistic to shoot for and will provide great payoff for himself and his team. As for Kazuha's best artifacts, it's very straightforward because his strongest set is by far 4-piece Viridescent Venerer. The synergy this set has with Kazuha is amazing, not just because he's an Anemo support who specializes in damage buffing, but also because he's one of the only Anemo supports that can easily and reliably double swirl, which allows 4-piece Viridescent to shred the resistance of 2 elements at once. It's also great for sub DPS Kazuha for the massive boost to his swirl damage, and overall there really isn't any other set that'll provide Kazuha with such a large enhancement to his already fluid playstyle. However, I guess it is worth mentioning that because of Kazuha's ability to very easily cause electro chain reactions, 4-piece Thundering Fury is actually a decent set on him. I'm sure you've seen somewhere on the internet about Kazuha situationally running this set, but basically it allows him to constantly shorten the cooldown of his skill, which for a sub DPS build will allow him to spam his skill on the field over an extended period of field time. But this set is much more for fun than it is an optimal set choice, and you have to consider that this set only functions in AoE situations, because without multiple enemies, you really can't chain react electro reactions, thus making the 4-piece passive useless. Still though, it's a pretty fun set to try out, but neither this set nor any other set comes close to the impact that Viridescent Venerer has on Kazuha's strength. Now, as for Kazuha's artifact stats, this is a huge debate in the community, which it really shouldn't be, because it's not that complicated to deal with. The most straightforward thing to note is that Kazuha requires at least 160% energy recharge because of the importance of his burst, and you could honestly end up needing even more than that depending on his teammates and how much energy they generate. For a full buffer support Kazuha, you'll find the most value by running triple elemental mastery main stats as long as you've already reached his 160% energy recharge requirement or his energy is covered by other teammates. But if you're having trouble reaching the required energy recharge with stats, it might be more worth running swords like Favonius Sword, Sack Sword, or Skyward Blade over Iron Sting so that your Kazuha doesn't run the risk of falling behind on rotations. Because as I said, his burst is vital to his ability to function fully while off the field. With a focused or full elemental mastery build like this, you'll find that Kazuha's team-wide elemental damage buff becomes much more significant, and his own swirl damage will also become huge, making him especially powerful in multi-target situations, even despite not having traditional offensive main stats. Many players like to think that a sub-DPS Kazuha will output higher damage with few or none of these elemental mastery main stats in favor of traditional offensive stats like crit and anemo damage, but that's actually not usually the case. If you plan on running Kazuha more focused as a sub-DPS who dishes out his own high anemo damage, you can run a traditional stat spread with, for example, an anemo damage goblet, an attack, EM or ER sands, and a crit circlet. But this choice of stats will only deal competitive damage in single target situations, and it will effectively lock you out of a considerable amount of Kazuha's value as a buffer. And while yes, in single target situations, his own personal damage can make up for a portion of the lost damage from his buffs, it's not a particularly large margin of compensation, and in AoE situations, it actually usually ends up being notably less total team damage than if you were to play a focused or full EM Kazuha. But anyways, as for his substats, if you're running a focused or full elemental mastery build, your first priority is reaching a suitable amount of energy recharge, then you can collect elemental mastery stats, but it's also worth noting that you should try to aim for a few crit rate stats too if you end up running Kazuha with Favonius Sword, which I'll talk more about shortly. For a DPS build though, energy recharge substats are still just as important, and elemental mastery comes in handy too, but you'll also find lots of value in attack percent and crit stats in order to balance out a stable crit ratio. Alright, moving on to Kazuha's best weapons. My recommendations will, as you'd expect, depend on how you want to play your Kazuha, so I'm gonna start with his best support weapons and then discuss his best DPS weapons. First and foremost, Freedom Sworn is generally Kazuha's best in slot, as it'll provide him a very large amount of elemental mastery, which allows you to either focus the necessary energy recharge main stats you need, or just go insane with the elemental mastery for his buffing potential. The passive also grants a team-wide attack percent and damage buff when Kazuha triggers multiple swirl reactions, even if he's off the field, so it's very easy for him to trigger, although it does have an 8-second downtime, so you'll generally want to work around this by making sure the passive doesn't trigger until your main carry is about to take to the field. Now, although this weapon blatantly caters to Kazuha's supportive and buffer playstyle, it's important to note that because of the high elemental mastery bonus, it actually does help to increase Kazuha's personal damage by quite a bit through swirls and AoE damage, which makes Freedom Sworn's overall damage potential competitive with his best DPS sword options in AoE situations. If Freedom Sworn is above your luck and or budget though, luckily for Kazuha lovers, Iron Sting is a completely free-to-play craftable sword that somewhat emulates the value of Freedom Sworn. It grants the wielder a pretty good amount of elemental mastery and doesn't need refinements to be optimal, which makes it a respectable weapon for both a supportive Kazuha and a DPS Kazuha in AoE situations, especially with refinements, but again, you don't need these refinements to enjoy the weapon's general strengths. It is very important to note though that while this weapon does generally outperform every other weapon except Freedom Sworn on a supportive and or AoE damage Kazuha build, it only does that if you've already reached a comfortable amount of energy recharge, so while it is a great free-to-play weapon, you shouldn't sacrifice Kazuha's ability to consistently cast his burst just for Iron Sting. Oh, and remember, the EM bonus this sword grants at maximum level is actually less than you'll get from an EM main stat artifact, so rather than using this weapon as an excuse to run an energy recharge sands, you really should only use it if you've already found a comfortable energy recharge percent on your Kazuha through substats and you just want more buffing power. And as such, another very solid option that I'd argue is competitive with Iron Sting in many situations is the Favonius Sword. If you're struggling to find enough energy recharge in your artifact stats, this weapon will provide competitive benefits to that of Iron Sting, as it completely covers Kazuha's energy requirements while also turning him into a good team battery with its weapon passive. So, since your energy requirements are completely covered by this weapon, you'll instead be able to focus your artifacts fully into other valuable stats such as Elemental Mastery. But you'll also need to grab a decent amount of crit rate to reliably proc Fav Sword's passive. For somewhat similar reasons, you can also run Sack Sword, but for the same reasons why I'd argue Kazuha's C1 isn't always as valuable as it comes across as, I'd say this sword is generally generally not as great as Favonia's sword because you won't be able to abuse its passive without losing team damage if your main carries take up lots of field time. Finally, you can use Skyward Blade on Kazuha under the assumption that it'll help you to slot a full Elemental Mastery build without worrying about energy recharge, but if your energy recharge requirements are close to or already satisfied, Skyward Blade, and every other ER weapon for that matter, will generally be a worse pick than Iron Sting. Because while Kazuha does need good energy recharge, there is such thing as too much. You'd just be wasting what could have been extra offensive stats. Now, as for DPS Kazuha, I have two swords that I have yet to mention. Firstly, Jade Cutter is a very solid option for DPS Kazuha because it's going to provide him an absurd crit rate and a decent damage boost passive, which is generally enough to allow him to focus on lots of offensive artifact stats for high personal damage, but this sword forces a heavy restriction on Kazuha's Elemental Mastery, which will tank his AoE damage, his swirl damage, and his team buff, in favor of higher single target and personal damage. As for the second DPS weapon I had yet to mention, I'd say Mist Splitter is the only other weapon worth mentioning because it does provide some crit value as well as a high base attack, and its passives aren't bad on Kazuha, although he can't actually fully activate them before C6. In general, I'd recommend saving this weapon for other units like Ayaka, Kuching, Ayato, and even Bennett, but it's not bad on Kazuha. It just creates a generally similar effect as I mentioned with Jade Cutter, where it forces a single target and personal damage focus onto him, which objectively speaking isn't the most effective way to play Kazuha, but it isn't by any means unviable. I actually almost forgot about the new Kazuha story quest weapon, Cursed Blade, which is being marketed as a weapon for Kazuha, but do not let that fool you, it is very much not great on him. With a support and elemental mastery build, obviously this weapon provides no value whatsoever, not just because of its lack of an EM or ER bonus stat, but also because an elemental mastery Kazuha build can't make strong use of the weapon's passive at all. He doesn't have a high total attack to begin with. But even for personal damage Kazuha, this sword really isn't that great. If you're genuinely struggling to find an accessible DPS sword because you're hellbent on ADC Kazuha, this weapon as well as Amanoma Kageuchi are going to be your best copium options, and they'll both perform similarly to one another, but even then, I'd almost prefer recommending Amanoma because of its much more unique and useful passive. And while there are other weapons such as Summit Shaper, Haran, etc., none of them compete with the aforementioned weapons, some of which are completely free to obtain, so for simplicity we skip those and we move on to team comping, which is going to be quite nuanced because I could simply wrap it up by saying Kazuha is good in literally any team that deals cryo, hydro, pyro, or electro damage, which is like 95% of teams, but that would be oversimplifying some of Kazuha's amazing synergies and the influence he's had on Genshin team building, so I'm gonna briefly go over some of his most popular and powerful teams and synergies. What you must note about Kazuha is that as a buffer support and a sub DPS, there are currently only 6 main DPS units in the entire game that don't benefit in some way from his power. As a reliable crowd controller and a top tier buffer support, any number of teams can be built around characters like Kuching, Ayaka, Ayato, Raiden, Ganyu, Hutao, Child, Uemia, etc., and benefit significantly from having Kazuha on the team for his offensive utility. So in relatively no particular order, I'm gonna discuss the teams that I consider to benefit the most from Kazuha being placed in them, whether for his uniqueness as opposed to other animal units or his raw power above other animal units. Starting with freeze teams, because I feel like Kazuha has fundamentally changed how modern freeze teams work. Given that he has the ability to easily double swirl both hydro and cryo, he's effectively the best animal support in the game for freeze teams that include characters like Ayaka, Kaya, and Rosaria, because they can work with Xingqiu, Yelan, Kokumi, or Mona to dish out insane cryo damage and insane hydro damage, on top of Kazuha's own swirls and anemo damage as well. In regards to Ganyu's freeze teams, Kazuha is still just as strong in practice, but Venti has much more synergy with Ganyu, what with his ability to enable quadratic scaling on Ganyu's burst as well as his unmatched crowd control, which Ganyu needs a lot of over a long period of time. So no, Kazuha isn't weak with Ganyu by any means, it's just that Venti is the superior choice in that specific scenario. Still though, for Ayaka and other melee cryo units, Kazuha has completely upscaled the power of freeze teams. Another very popular team that Kazuha has influenced is the national team and some of its many variants. The most powerful of which is one in which you pair Kazuha with Child, Bennett, and Xiangling, and the reason this one is so powerful is because with a certain somewhat difficult rotation, Kazuha can actually double swirl Hydro and Pyro, allowing Child and Xiangling to end up dealing very high vape damage together, and not to mention... Oh my god, there's a thunderstorm, I apologize. And not to mention, with Kazuha's crowd control, it is possible for Child's Riptides to reliably enjoy quadratic scaling, making the team that much more powerful with Kazuha in it. And if you don't have Child though, you can opt instead for Xingqiu in this spot, which will still prove to be a powerful team, just less powerful than the Child variant. There are... Raiden, I'ma need you to stop. There are, as I said, other variations of National Team that Kazuha has impacted quite heavily, including Raiden National, in which Kazuha replaces Xiangling's spot in favor of reliable crowd control and significant damage buffs for Raiden and Xingqiu/Yelan to enjoy. Another team style that's been heavily influenced by Kazuha though is Mono Pyro, which is quite funny since Klee is also rerunning with Kazuha and they work really well together in this team. Inside of Mono Pyro, Kazuha provides huge pyro damage buffs for the team, and his own flexible rotations make the team very easy to play in, as it mostly just focuses on bombarding enemies with skills and bursts seemingly at random. And while other mono element teams like Cryo, Hydro, and Electro do still theoretically enjoy Kazuha for the same reasons, Mono Pyro is generally the most suitable as of 2.8 because of Bennett and Xiangling's synergy with Kazuha and the team. Other less notable but still honorable mentions for powerful teams with Kazuha include variations of Taser teams because of his ability to double swirl Electro and Hydro, as well as his very high swirl damage output in this team. But it's worth noting that in general with Taser teams, Sucrose will outperform a C0 Kazuha if there are a lot of off-field DPS units like Beidou, Fischl, Xingqiu, Yelan, etc. because Sucrose acts as an amazing driver and by extension swirl enabler for them. Not to say Kazuha is significantly or even usually worse than Sucrose in these teams, it's just that she has a somewhat situational advantage with her animo-infused normal attacks. But another honorable mention is variations of Melt teams, most specifically those in which Kazuha can replace Xiangling to enable Melt for carries like Ganyu. His ability to consistently spread Pyro with the help of Bennett will allow Ganyu to trigger Melt, and his ability to buff her cryo damage beforehand should allow her to reach some very high Frostbloom numbers. But I think you get the idea. There are so many teams in which Kazuha can either substitute for his fellow animo supports and sub DPSs or completely take on a role of his own, boasting a unique yet near infinitely flexible playstyle and kit that can boost the power of almost any team in the game. If I were to go through every single team that Kazuha fits into, we'd be here literally all day discussing said teams and their many variants, which is why I'm only mentioning the most notable, specifically the ones that Kazuha has the biggest influence on. But in general, you can fit him into virtually any non-Geo/Animo focused team and find good value in doing so. But I believe that finally rounds out my updated 2.8 Kazuha guide, and I'm excited to have been able to make such an in-depth guide on possibly my favorite character in Genshin Impact because he's so complex and yet so fun and practical to use. I don't know, he's gotta have one of the most objectively good character designs in the game, at least in terms of gameplay. If you enjoyed this video or it helped you in any way, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, as it would be super cool and awesome and cool. Also, you should totally join my Discord server to stay up to date with myself, my content, and my community, because I would love to see you around. Alright, I'm gonna dip, but before I go, you should totally follow me on Twitch because I'm gonna be hopefully C6ing Kazuha on stream once his banner drops tomorrow. Alright, bye Kazuha lovers and soon to be Kazuha havers.